I've been playing Sekiro for about a year. I've replayed the game about 9 times, got all the endings, beat every boss, gave the sculptor countless amounts of sake,
Ah, it burns the throat, same as ever.
and even got the Platinum Trophy. I can safely say I know this game, the levels, enemy placements, and mechanics front and back to warrant actually talking about it now. Released in March of 2019, Sekiro has slowly become one of my favorite games of the year, but it took a long time for this game to reach that milestone for me, even after beating it a couple times. My early impressions with this game are most likely consistent with others. The gameplay was extremely daunting, more so than Dark Souls and Bloodborne. Sekiro has a very steep learning curve that'll most likely scare away early adopters enough to make them want to return it. I was the same. My plan for this video is to analyze why this is. My name is Ophelia Dante, and welcome to my critique of Sekiro, Shadows Die Twice.
残酷な天使のように少年よ神話になれ
See, Sekiro is probably a masterpiece, but the game is very bad at showing the player how great it is. Now, the format of the game is no different than previous Soulsborne games. You wander a semi-open world, navigating fairly linear obstacles from one checkpoint to another. Occasionally, you'll fight a boss, and progress once you become good enough to defeat them. Soulsborne games, to this point, have always had a fairly simple gameplay meta. Health bar, stamina bar, some form of currency gained by defeating enemies. You lose all that currency when you die. Sekiro completely reinvents that meta, even more so than Dark Souls 2 or Bloodborne. New to Soulsborne is the apparent absence of a stamina bar to be replaced with what the game calls posture. In a sense, it almost operates like the invisible poise stat in Dark Souls. As such, you're freely able to attack and sprint non-stop, leading to much more kinetic combat. For the first time ever, your character is capable of jumping, and it adds so much to make level design more vertically open, and can potentially make combat more dynamic and diverse. You're unfortunately confined to one main weapon the whole game, but this is remedied with new unlockable abilities and your prosthetic arm. Instead of collecting souls or blood echoes, defeating enemies gives you skill points. Think of any Ubisoft sandbox title, it essentially functions the same. As you progress through the game, you'll gain access to 5 different types of esoteric texts, each offering different upgrades like new moves, passive abilities, or just flat bonuses to do something. However, upon dying, you are now unable to retrieve any lost skill points. The game will drain half of what is currently in the bar, though you'll never completely lose skill levels, just the bar will be drained in increments. The same applies to the game's standard new currency system. What's also new is the game's revival system. Upon dying any time in the Ashina outskirts, you'll be introduced to this mechanic, where you will be revived on the spot with half your max health.
Loyal wolf, take my blood and live again.
By default, you'll be able to revive twice, but not in a row. It's a little complicated, but basically reviving just once will black out the second revival gauge. Die again right after and you'll fully die. It'll become open once again once you complete a death blow. Later on, you can upgrade this to 3 revivals. This means you could potentially have 4 health bars, but even the health bar has seen an overhaul. You don't upgrade your health like previous games. Instead, you'll collect 4 prayer beads to increase your max health. I think it's about 20% more. It operates a lot like the blue orbs in Devil May Cry, though they're not secret collectibles and you'll naturally amass enough from fighting mini-bosses. Instead of using souls to increase your strength, you'll get it by fighting bosses. A sort of odd but interesting thing about Sekiro is the 2 types of bosses. These roaming mini-bosses who will normally sport 2 health bars, and the much bigger and unique bosses, the latter of which are usually the hardest. Defeating these guys will net you a memory, which gives you a brief detail of who you just defeated. You use these to increase your strength. The main issue with this meta is that Sekiro does a poor job of introducing itself to the player, and the central culprit of this flaw lies within a few main faults in the early levels. Number 1, deflections and posture. Number 2, early leveling progression. And number 3, the chained ogre. Let's start from the top. In past entries, parrying was a heavily risk versus reward mechanic that you didn't really need to do. It was a simple but optional mechanic that was hard to pull off, but it was a good way to do loads of damage to enemies who were vulnerable to them. In Sekiro, this has become the main mechanic to fighting almost every enemy. Instead of having a stamina meter, you have what the game calls posture. Both you and the enemy have one, intuitively displayed on the top and bottom of the screen respectively. Instead of dodging subsequent attacks and retaliating once an opening is made, you'll instead time blocks and perform a deflection. In concept, it works just like the parry mechanic in Dark Souls, but to a different avail. Instead of stunning an enemy, you'll instead drain their posture. Once their posture meter is empty, or rather full, they'll enter the stun animation, wherein they're vulnerable to a death blow, killing them. When I first played this, I found this mechanic rather odd, because enemies still have health bars, but attacking them doesn't affect their health. Enemies will naturally react to attacks by blocking. Practically every attack is blocked as long as they are aggro. Attacking them like this will drain their posture, but ever so slightly compared to deflections. The death blow finisher was something I found off-putting. I felt it was a tedious extra input to essentially defeat an enemy. That's because Sekiro isn't so much an action game as it is a stealth action hybrid.
What?
The first couple levels will have you naturally sneaking by enemies. You'll use your new prosthetic arm to grapple on top of things or cliff faces to vertically traverse enemies. Since you're now capable of jumping, you now have a second means of navigating levels and enemies during fights. The first level does a good job to show the player how much more open levels are. Level progression is still fairly linear, but now individual levels have an array of separate paths. You could navigate the more treacherous ground and face enemies head on, or you might want to climb the top rooftops and mountains to climb more overhead enemies. But then you come across the Chained Ogre, the worst first boss in the whole series. This is the boss I hypothesize is the reason people find Sekiro so difficult. He's one of the game's gatekeepers, an obstacle that keeps the player from progressing further into the game without defeating first. Up to this point, the game has been teaching you that damaging posture is the meat and bones of the combat. You need to parry and retaliate appropriately to drain their posture and perform a death blow. The Chained Ogre doesn't do this. It makes the uncanny return to traditional boss fights by making you drain its health bar instead of its posture. I loathe this boss on every single run. Believe me, the issue isn't as simple as deterring the status quo to add variety. It's how the boss presents itself. By this section, you have fought 3 bosses: the samurai dude in the tutorial level, Genichiro, and the other samurai dude in the Ashina outskirts. You don't actually need to fight any of these guys. You can easily run past the 2 samurai in their respective levels, and the game will let you do that. You can progress further through the level without needing to defeat them or begin the fight with them. You fight Genichiro, yeah, but you don't even need to defeat him either. You're supposed to lose. You can't even perform a stealth death blow to make his health shorter. The Chained Ogre is positioned in a way that he will always see you, no matter the angle. You can kinda cheat the AI by running back and into the area and stealth death blow when its back is turned, but this method is honestly pretty cheap, and it definitely isn't intended by design. Another issue I have with it is your attacks don't feel impactful. Every enemy you fought across naturally reacts to every sword swing you make, recoiling to your attacks to make it visually apparent that your sword swings are making an impact. You don't fight the Chained Ogre like you have fought previous enemies. Its attacks are too heavy to parry, and unlike previous titles, you can't just dodge roll through its attacks to conventionally avoid attacks. It also, in my opinion, commits the cardinal sin of having grab attacks that do way too much damage. I absolutely hate these grabs, because I never thought Soulsborne games had good enough hitboxes to make these attacks fair. The most optimal way to avoid these attacks is to simply jump out of them, but unless you're pinpoint precise, this doesn't always work. In New Game Plus, if your health bar isn't fully upgraded enough, these attacks can straight up one-shot you on a whim. Because you're attacking its health, the fight can subsequently take much longer, which leads to more opportunities for these grabs to kill you. So the Chained Ogre feels like an odd difficulty spike because its mechanics don't reflect the mechanics of the level's enemies. Another flaw with the game's beginning is how unforgiving it is. In previous Soulsborne games, you're given a modest amount of health items. The Estus Flask was a genius mechanic that worked as a checkmark for mistakes you can make between bonfires. An indicator of your improvement as a player is how little time you'll need to chug an Estus. Sekiro does have something like this, the healing gourd given to you by the Divine Error in the tutorial level. My main issue with this is the game starts you out with 2 small health bar and 2 little healing gourds. Anyone's first run in a Soulsborne game is going to be filled with mistakes because they're still getting used to the controls and the level design. Naturally, they're going to get hurt a lot and probably die a lot too. This truth is increased tenfold because of how different this game is. You do have a secondary means of healing via pellets, think life gems from Dark Souls 2, a finite item that slowly heals you over time, but in Sekiro there's significantly more finite. Only 3 can be held at a time between shrine rests. The gourd is a moot point admittedly, because it doesn't take long for you to upgrade its maximum amount via these gourd seeds. You'll get 10 in total by the end of the game. But if you ask me, it would have served a much better mechanic if you started the player with 3 or 5 gourd uses at the beginning of the game, with the trade-off of making gourd seeds rarer or more hidden. 5 would be enough for beginners to get the hang of the combat without dying so often, and it would ideally be enough to go through the whole game with just 5, and the off chance the player can't find any seeds. If not that, my favorite change was to make Breath of Life a default skill. This gives you health upon performing a death blow. I think it's a mistake that this move is put so late in the skill tree, because it essentially puts less strain on using healing items. It operates much like Bloodborne's Valiant mechanic, damaging enemies moments after you receive damage to heal yourself. My main issue with the default gourd is that it doesn't account for healing yourself between fights. During a fight, this ability is obviously going to be useless, but when you're stealthing around, backstabbing enemies left and right to heal yourself, it serves as a more intuitive way to heal yourself after a tough fight. The gourd will ideally be used during lengthy fights when you can't rely on death blows to heal, and since the alternate outskirts is going to most likely have you sneaking around anyways, having a low gourd count would actually force players to shift their tactics towards clearing areas instead of just simply avoiding dangerous encounters. It would help to make the beginning area more forgiving, and it wouldn't be cheating because you're still incentivized to defeat enemies for money and skill points. Though what I do like about the game overall is how plentiful the game's bonfires are. These shrines. A progressive design change. These shrines are placed more plentifully to make these levels not feel like marathons. Dark Souls had always had an issue with making bonfires too far away from difficult boss fights, and, as a result, would make them a chore to fight on repeated instances. Sekiro will always place a shrine near or right before a boss fight. You'll be able to get right back into the boss after every death. I really appreciate this. I complained a lot about the Chained Ogre, where there's at least a shrine right before it. These shrines are also where you upgrade your skill tree, maximum health, and strength. A good change is that sitting at a shrine will not automatically restore your health and items, and reset the area and its enemies. You can now just do that manually. After the Chained Ogre, the game shows an admittedly cool and new element to the levels. Every so often you'll come across these set-piece-esque areas that feature some form of gimmick. In the area ahead, you'll find one of the game's 3 giant snakes. These Titan-like creatures are a nice pace breaker between the game's faster paced feel. You gotta use the game's environment to sneak by it, otherwise you'll be eaten. In this area, at one point, you'll hide in this little palanquin. The snake will try to peek inside, and once it gets close, you'll see that deathblow marker pop up and just stab the thing in the eye. It's super satisfying. These snakes only appear 2 more times in the game, one at the bottom of the sunken valley, and another after you fight the long-armed centipede giraffe. What a great fucking name. You can actually kill this snake, but it requires looping back from another level, and it's not even a boss fight, which is a bit of a shame. Another interesting set-piece level is located in the Sunken Valley. It's this huge empty canyon. The end goal is to reach this gun fort located on the other side, but it's lined up with a ton of sniper enemies. You'll need to dodge and weave these shots as you grapple from platform to platform, with an exciting run down a dilapidated bridge, but it's just barely missing you. You'll never get hit as long as you keep running, or you get unlucky. What I love most about this game is its fair share of nuance. This extends further than just having a variety of abilities, which I will touch on later. In any standard fight with an enemy, you're essentially standing dead center in front of them, rhythmically parrying each attack and retaliating accordingly. Though bosses have various of attacks that require different actions, the most notable of these are perilous attacks, the sweep and the stab. The sweep is countered, or rather dodged, by simply jumping. Jumping on the enemy immediately after will damage their posture. The stab, however, can be parried, but it drains a lot of your own posture. You'll instead counter these moves with the Makiri counter. In my opinion, this counter is completely broken. You're supposed to use the dodge button to activate the preemptive animation, but there's no strict timing to this. You can spam the dodge button moments before the attack lands and it'll still work. Though I find this attack to be a little inconsistent with the 7 Ashnir Spears enemies and the Shinobi Hunter bosses. But that's not all. Most if not every boss in the game have these barely deflectable heavy attacks. You can parry them, but doing so will make your character brace the ground, leaving them unable to move or retaliate quickly. The Umbrella prosthetic is kind of a fallback for attacks like these. They can block almost every attack easily, with no resulting recoil. The Umbrella prosthetic is admittedly also broken. When your character's posture runs out, he'll enter the staggered animation. Dark Souls had an issue where your character is vulnerable to attacks even as they're getting up from being knocked down. Sekiro solves this by allowing you to safety roll out of any subsequent attack at the last minute. This roll has way more iframes than the game's standard dodge. It's like, oh no, I'm down. Oh wait. And you'll get right back into the fight. It's neat. You can also do this with any attack that slams you to the ground. During boss fights, if you can time attacks just right, you can catch enemies off guard and damage their health bar directly. This in turn makes their posture drain faster. It requires skill and timing, and it's a great little mechanic if you ask me. These little animation nuances lead to fights that feel more dynamic than ever. There's a feeling of constant back and forth between you and the enemy, leading to boss encounters with great pace and a sense of direction no Soulsborne game has reached in my opinion. I found that these mechanics only work well when you're facing a humanoid with a weapon. The Armored Warrior is a great example of this. This really should have been the first boss, not the Chained Ogre.
For the sake of
Up to this point, you probably haven't been able to gauge just how powerful deflections are. Every so often you'll see these big brutes, often with big clubs that you realistically can't expect you can parry. This is another flaw I find with the game, not emphasizing how powerful your parry is. The Armored Warrior is this towering armored man, guarding the bridge to the Senpou Temple, and he is mandatory to defeat. He has this huge sword, which means his attacks are much slower and easier to read. He also has an unusual method of defeating him. This boss is my favorite because it was the first time I began feeling more confident with my parrying. If I can parry this humongous sword that looks heavier than me, then that means I can easily defeat those big brutes. I can't speak for anyone else, but this boss fight is a good learning tool, and really should have been placed much earlier in the game. A not so good example of this is probably the Guardian Ape, the main boss of the Sunken Valley. He starts out as this Bloodborne style beast, jumping and flailing around at you, and like the Chained Ogre, you're attacking its health and not its posture. I don't much like this fight. For one, it has this one grab where it jumps in the air and grabs you. I run into a few instances where I was just a couple notches too far from the attack, but it's still connected. I got grabbed and died. In general, I find his attacks to be too incomprehensible to feel fair. Some of his attacks are too fast to comfortably react to because they have almost no wind up, and it feels very tedious. It also doesn't help that the boss has a secret second phase upon completing the first death blow. This was extremely annoying because the first phase is such an endurance round for me, and I'd always run out of healing items before then. But you'll be surprised to learn that this second phase is actually much easier, arguably too easy. His attacks are much slower, and he'll always repeat the same 3-hit sword swing that you can easily parry. The third swing is always a heavy attack, so as long as you have the umbrella handy, you'll breeze through this phase pretty easily. The only complaint I have with the Guardian Ape is this wide AoE screen that will both damage you and inflict terror on you. It's not hard to avoid, but there's almost no tactic to this attack. You just run away and wait for the attack to end. And this boss has a nasty habit of doing it repeatedly. It's good for recovering health I suppose, but other than that it's pretty boring. There's an optional second version of this fight if you go to the poison pool area after. This one is a little annoying though, because halfway through the fight, the ape will summon another ape, essentially fighting both versions of the Guardian Ape at once. I think this second ape has less health, so it doesn't take long to kill, but far so than previous games, this game handles multiple enemies in a fight the worst. As a result, you'll likely be pulling your hair trying to focus on killing the ape first, only to get blindsided by the beheaded ape. Dark Souls always had a bad time pinning you against multiple enemies. The first game had it pretty bad because the more confined level design meant less space to circumnavigate multiple enemies in an area, and the attack patterns of certain enemies made it almost impossible to find an opening for you to retaliate. As the series went on, there's been slight gameplay tweaks to make multiple enemies more bearable to fight. Dark Souls 2 offered more open levels, and enemies were tweaked to attack more slowly and coherently to comfortably dodge and weave between attacks. Bloodborne gave you alternate weapon modes, which allowed you to hit multiple foes with a big weapon. However, Sekiro takes steps back, and now fighting multiple groups is more frustrating than ever, and I will tell you why. In any third-person action game, the lock-on is a solution to an accuracy problem any 3D game will have. You're playing a game that features 3D environments through a 2D screen, so as such, there's going to be some difficulty perceiving depth. The lock-on prominently introduced an Ocarina of Time, locked your character and thus your attacks towards an enemy so your attacks will never just miss. The camera also shift and zoom out to give a dynamic angle. Devil May Cry, Bayonetta, and Kingdom Hearts have these camera systems because it gives you a wide field of view, and thus equal attention on the locked on enemy as any other surrounding enemy. What also helps is that these action games will often give you a soft lock if you don't feel like using the lock on. Here, I am aiming directly away from the enemy next to me, but attacking will automatically spin me to the enemy and hit them. Even the widely disliked DMC had a soft lock mechanic too. However, Soulsborne games and their method for lock-on always felt archaic. Instead of giving you a wide angle, your camera is dead center on the enemy, and your character will strafe constantly facing towards said foe. Your camera angle is also angled slightly downward towards the ground. This gives you less of a field of view of your enemies to your left, right, and behind you. Mind you, this camera angle is good for some purposes. One of the shakier things about the DMC games is that certain moves require you to push the direction in accordance to where the enemy is in relation to the camera, and because of the pre-mentioned lack of depth, it's difficult to fully notice if your enemy is in front of you or behind you. This centered camera means your inputs are always absolute. But what Soulsborne games always lacked is a soft lock-on for attacks, which can make it hard to essentially aim your attacks when the camera is free. Coupled with your attacks having fairly small zoning capabilities, group fights can feel awkward. It's not always bad, however. Group fights can have a sense of awe and epicness, I guess. I once ran into a situation where I was fighting a big brute surrounded by smaller enemies with a rifleman firing from afar. This moment where I was dodging and weaving between rifle shots while carefully parrying the enemies before me, it was brilliant. Probably happened by accident, admittedly. It's rare moments like these that make you go, "Oh yeah! This is happening!" But that's what these things are. Moments. Soulsborne games always tend to have a sliver of jank, and Sekiro is no different. Partway through the first part of the game, you'll be informed about what is called a lightning reversal. After this, you'll fight Genichiro, a great boss fight, but there's also a moment where you might get to test this move out. He'll lace his sword with lightning and swing at you with it. If you hit, you'll take massive damage and get stunned with a shock status effect. What you're supposed to do is jump, block the moment the attack connects, and swing the attack back at Genichiro. This move is excellent, it looks cool, and you don't need skill points to unlock it. The only criticism I have for the move itself is, despite the game telling you otherwise, you actually don't need to block. If you jump in the air and just attack, you'll still complete the lightning reversal. I found this a little odd because the game makes it clear you still need to block. It tells you right there in the tutorial prompt, but you don't need to block. The only reason you would need to block is do the attack slightly faster, but as long as you spam the attack button, you'll still complete the attack. You don't even take less damage when you block, so yeah, a little weird. The only complaint I have with this is Genichiro is the only boss you will do his attack on up until the end of the game. There's an area called the Fountainhead Palace which is filled with enemies that can do these attacks, but outside of this area and the last boss fight with Ishin, no one else does this, so the pacing of introducing this mechanic and practically abandoning it until the end game is a little weird. Something I also find odd is, whether this was intentional or not, some mechanics are just straight up contradicted by certain enemies. One of the more difficult mini-bosses you'll face is Snake Eyes. She has this one grab that does devastating amounts of damage if it connects, and in my experience, simply jumping away from the grab doesn't always work. But did you know you can parry the grab? I sure didn't. Shoutouts to Lady Tolvo for sharing this information on her Twitter. I never would have found out otherwise. What makes this kinda bad is this is literally the only enemy you can deflect grabs from. I assume this is because Snake Eye uses her rifle to grab you instead of her hands? It's strange, I don't know why this is implemented. Sekiro also has the issue where some attack animations are just simply too fast to react to, or the animations themselves aren't very easy to read. One example would be these lone shadow enemies. The first time you'll fight them is in the Ashina Reservoir, but you can also fight them much earlier in the Harada state. This enemy has one attack pattern where he will barrage you with constant kicks, with the last one being a charged up tornado kick, I guess. It might not seem like it at first, but you can Makiri counter this attack. I found this out by accident, mostly because I never read this attack like Waffle would be able to stomp on his foot to complete the counter. It's odd. The corrupted monk has this one attack where he will sweep with his long spear, only to immediately follow up with a terror vomit attack while you are still in the air. This is borderline unfair because he does not always do this attack, and because it's a sweep, you're supposed to jump on him to complete the parry. The only method I found was that you need to jump away from him upon landing on him, because otherwise the attack will connect and it can one-shot you. Because of the pre-mentioned lock-on camera angle, certain perilous attacks are difficult to distinguish from one another. I think it'd be cheating if sweeps and stabs were differentiated by colors instead of symbols, but the fact that they're both red makes it a little difficult to instinctively tell them apart. That's not criticism, by the way, it's part of the challenge. You need to read their ready up animation to determine which perilous attacks are going to hit you. What's not so good is certain bosses and their perilous attacks can look way too similar to fairly react to by muscle memory. Genichiro has this one move where he will do a Zelda 2 style downward stab, immediately following up with a normal stab. Halfway through the fight, this will change to sometimes be a sweep instead. This isn't very good because your camera is momentarily pointed upwards to track him jumping into the air. When he's landed on the ground, you only have brief moments before the camera catches up and you just need to instantly react to the correct attack. When you fight him again in the final boss fight, this can feel a little cheap because the character model can be obscured by the tall flowers. I absolutely love the aesthetics of this game, even more so than Bloodborne. One complaint I had with Bloodborne was the constant nighttime setting led to areas looking much too visually similar, despite the game having a vast array of architecture in their levels. Now, despite the game's constant snowfall, Sekiro won't shy away from showing more prominent colors. How the game shifts from morning to sunset and finally nighttime gives the game a wide variety of visual flair, but part of me feels the visuals could have been knocked down a few pegs to make the game run better. I played the game on the PS4 because my laptop isn't powerful enough to run the Steam version, let alone be able to capture footage from it. Funnily enough, by comparison, this game does run a little smoother than Dark Souls 3 and Bloodborne, I find. It might have something to do with the fact that the game uses prominent motion blur to mask 30 FPS. Now, this won't be a problem on PC where the frame rate is uncapped, but Sekiro doesn't run well on consoles either. I've run into several moments where the game would just stutter or slow down when I was traveling around normally. You can see this more prominently when you reach the top of Ashina Castle. Also, because of this, I run into a few bugs where sword swings would just not collide with wolf during fights. I think it would have been better if Sekiro took a page from Neo and The Last of Us and allow us to lower the resolution and graphics down a peg to make the game run at a higher frame rate. Though I know implementing a feature like this probably isn't as easy as it sounds, and maybe it running the way it is currently is better than making the engine unstable for a more variable frame rate on console. So I don't know. Another thing unique to this game is that some boss fights are locked behind certain endings. In total there's 4. The Shura ending, the Immortal Severance, Purification, and Dragon's Return. The Shura ending is the simplest, but probably also the hardest, but you'll be rushed into an early final boss against Lady Emma and Ishin. This fight plays out much differently than Ishin in the actual ending. It can feel a little hectic. He does this one Virgil style screen nuke attack followed up by a rush attack. If you're not using the umbrella prosthetic, this fight can be quite a challenge. The other secret boss is a rematch against the Owl in the Harada estate. Doing this requires you go after the Purification ending, which I can safely say is one of the most convoluted things to do in any game. I implore you to look up a guide for this. Now, the boss fight is pretty good, I don't really feel like getting footage for it, but what's really annoying is that there's 2 prayer beads that are only accessible via this ending. I imagine players going nuts searching high and low for those last 2 prayer beads, only to look up their locations and realize they gotta play the whole game all over again to get this ending. I consider the Owl the hardest boss in the game if it weren't for one more I haven't mentioned. The Demon of Hatred. By and large, the Demon of Hatred is the most difficult fight in all of Sekiro, and it's my absolute favorite. Full context, when you're defeated by Genichiro at the beginning, you're drugged to safety by this one-armed sculptor. He's the one that outfits you with the prosthetic arm. Throughout the game, you'll acquire various kinds of sake and tea, which you can give to the sculptor to unveil some of his backstory.
This really brings back memories.
Did you drink this often?
I trained in the techniques of the shinobi, in the valley where the monkeys dwelled.
By yourself?
No, there were 2 of us. We were rogue shinobi. There was no proper master for the likes of us. That's why we went to the valley. To run, to jump, to clash swords. where one slip would mean your doom. That was how we trained. We came to move exactly as monkeys did after a time. I'd drink this monkey booze whenever I tired of training, and I'd listen to the howl of my partner's whistling finger while I drank.
Howl?
It was from his unique ring. Whistling through that ring would fill the valley with a somber melody. Strangely enough, I enjoyed that sound. I listened to it so often.
One interesting detail is that his left arm was cut off by Lord Ishin many years ago. The sculptor explains that this was done to prevent Shura, this kind of demonic force that can possess those who have succumbed to anger and have lost all virtue.
He did it for my sake. I was on the verge of being consumed.
Consumed by what?
Shura. Well, whether you believe me or not, that's for you to decide. But you do well to beware Shura's shadow.
After you defeated the Divine Dragon, you'll be teleported back to Ashina Castle, only to find that it's under full invasion by shinobi. Exploring around, you'll find a dying soldier begging you to help his brethren fighting in the Ashina outskirts. You travel there and find that the place is on fire and in ruins, and what awaits on the other side but this huge monster with a flaming arm. This is the sculptor, succumbing to Shura because Ishin finally passed away, I think. Fun fact, if you go back to the dilapidated temple, you'll find that the sculptor is nowhere to be seen and the trees at Ashina outskirts completely burned away. Just, something to notice there, Like the Chained Ogre, this is a fully defeat by draining its health, not its posture. But this fight is so tucked away and held so far back into the end of the game, I think it honestly deserves it. It has 3 health bars, is the biggest entity in the whole game, and the large arena you find him in is just barely big enough for his type of moveset. I love this fight because compared to the Chained Ogre, this fight not only feels fair, but the nature of the fight requires you to abandon everything the game has taught you about parrying. You're not fighting a man, you're fighting a monster. The only complaint I have with this boss is it is basically mandatory that you use the umbrella prosthetic to counter certain moves. Not only that, but the camera can make attacking him directly feel a little awkward. At the date of this video, there hasn't been any DLC released for Sekiro, and seeing that FromSoft already announced their next working project, I think the Demon of Hatred tosses my favorite boss in all of Soulsborne, just barely beating Orphan of Kos. I love this game, but I also hate it. Sekiro has the means to be the best Soulsborne entry in the whole series. It's at least my favorite now. What holds it back in my eyes is its lack of communication and its fairly unfriendly difficulty. This game, more so than ever, streamlines the mechanics of Dark Souls to a point that it feels more restricted, thus progressing further through the game is harder than it's ever been. Say you had trouble with a hard boss in Dark Souls, you could always call a friend or an NPC companion to help you out. Or if not that, the RPG leveling system makes it so you'll eventually be able to tank through bosses. Not Sekiro though. It's either you beat this boss, or you don't, and you never progress further. Now I was able to beat this game, multiple times. I can beat every boss and enemy type with ease, but the game just simply starts out too hard for beginners, and it's due to the masochistic culture these Soulsborne games just sadly reside in. And unlike past entries, there's no way to make it easier for yourself. Weirdly enough, everything in the game exists to make it harder. You can play the game with this demon bell that makes enemies hit harder, and you can play without Kiro's charm, making it so you take damage if you don't perform perfect deflections. People want Sekiro to have an easy mode, but it's like the game already starts in the easy mode. It's absurd. Here's the kicker too. Once you get used to the game, it actually doesn't get any harder if you ask me. A big flaw in the game's progression is that you never go beyond fighting just simple soldiers and the occasional brute. Certain areas vary for sure, but you'll always come across some animal easily killed with shurikens, enemies wielding spears are just quickly taken down with one Mikiri counter, you never fight enemies with shields outside of these few encounters, and everything in between is just something you just parry to defeat. I complained a lot about the Chained Ogre for a reason. His inclusion in the game isn't at all the issue. Giant monsters are never a common enemy in this game, because the parry system requires that you fight enemies with some form of weapon. The Chained Ogre sticks out because there's never more enemies like him. More unique foes that require you to change up your playstyle to play more aggressively instead of defensively. Because of this, there's no defined difficulty curve if you ask me. You'll never evolve past fighting enemies with sticks. Once you've beaten Genichiro the first time, you've practically beaten the game. The reason the game is considered so hard is because the game never gives you the confidence in its abilities it gives you. It's not because players need to get good. The game says you can parry grabs. The game says you can block to perform a lightning reversal. People say you need to get good, but none of that is true.
Sekiro, farewell.
Thank you for watching. This is my first extensively long review of, well, anything, really. I sort of stumbled my way through writing the script, and as such, there's a few things I couldn't fit into the video. Owen of the Water is a really great mini-boss. I think she might also be the hardest, and her unique moveset and dialogue makes her extremely memorable. If you defeat the Guardian Ape before any other area, you'll sometimes come across these apparitions. They're not extensively difficult, but I do like how much these areas can change. The Headless and Shishiman warriors are cool secret bosses that I'm glad are completely optional. I love the way the Headless would delay their attacks, making you actually time blocks instead of relying on rhythmic muscle memory, though the ones located in the water are very clunky to fight, especially the one located at the bottom of the Fountainhead Palace. The Shishiman warrior are admittedly too easy. If you use the Divine Confetti and rush them down, you can easily defeat them no problem. Same goes for Headless, but the Headless actually fight back more aggressively. The game no longer lets you walk off ledges into bottomless pits, and they no longer kill you if you fall down them, you'll just take damage instead. This is streamlining I welcome wholeheartedly. The Harada Estate is a neat little side area that does wonders to expand the lore of Wolf and the world around him. I feel as though this area probably should have been more hidden and placed much further in the game, kind of like the Archdragon Peak in Dark Souls 3. But I think this area is supposed to be an alternate route if players just simply can't get past the Chained Ogre, and the Shinobi Hunter is honestly a much better first boss than him. Maybe the first level should have been this after you fought Genichiro, and once you cleared it, you wake up in the dilapidated temple and the alternate outskirts would be the beginning of the game. You would still be able to warp back to the Harada State afterwards. I don't know, maybe that would have made repeated runs more exhausting. Needing to refight Genichiro every time you die in the final boss is a little tiring, not because it makes the whole fight too grueling, but because Genichiro is a way more boring fight than Ishin. He doesn't do anything with the Black Mortal Blade besides his one attack, and he always starts the fight with his attack. Other than that, his move pool is entirely the same as before. I just think it would have been better if he just immediately fought Ishin on subsequent attempts. But yeah, those are my painfully extensive thoughts on the game. I hope you enjoyed what I had to say, and I love you.